The year was 1867, and the town of Red Rock lay crouched against the wind like a beaten dog. Dust moved through its single street in restless swirls, catching on the boots of men who'd long forgotten mercy. Inside the courthouse, a squat wooden building with warped floorboards and the smell of sweat and ink, a woman stood trembling before the bench. Her name was Clara Hensley, and her face bore the thin, drawn look of someone who'd been running too long from the world and had finally been cornered. Her hands clutched the small shoulders of her boy, Eli, a wiry child with hair the color of sun-bleached straw. He was 5, maybe 6, too young to understand the language of debt and ownership, but old enough to sense danger in the air. When he tugged on his mother's skirt and whispered, "Mama, are they mad at us?" she pressed his head against her chest and said nothing. Words would have broken her. Judge Harmon cleared his throat, looking down at the papers before him as if they were some burden he wished someone else would carry. His spectacles slid down his nose. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, "the facts are plain. Your late husband borrowed heavily from Mr. Talbot, using your homestead as collateral. The debt remains unpaid. The land must now pass to its rightful owner." The rightful owner sat 3 rows back, legs spread wide, a black hat tilted low over his pale eyes. Cyrus Talbot had the look of a man who'd never worked a day in the dust, but owned plenty who did. His coat was too fine for Red Rock, his boots polished to a cruel shine. He smiled faintly when Clara looked at him, as if he enjoyed the spectacle of her ruin. "My husband, he meant to pay," Clara stammered, her voice quivering. "He died before—" "Death," Talbot interrupted, rising from his chair, "doesn't settle a man's obligations. The land is mine by law, and the child," his gaze slid to Eli, "will remain under my protection until such a time the widow can prove she's fit to care for him. That's what the papers say." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A woman near the back muttered something about decency. Someone else spat into the sawdust. The judge raised his gavel for silence. Clara took a step forward, eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't take my boy." "Mrs. Hensley," the judge said gently, "Mr. Talbot has influence in this county. I advise you to accept his offer quietly. It's for the child's welfare." Her knees nearly gave. The room swam in heat and humiliation. She could hear Eli's breathing quicken against her dress. "Please," she whispered, "please don't take my child away." The words seemed to hang there, too fragile to touch. No one moved. No one dared. Then, from the back corner, came the slow sound of a chair scraping across wood. The crowd turned as a tall man rose and stepped into the dim light, filtering through the cracked window. His clothes were plain, a faded duster, dust-caked boots, but the way he carried himself made the air change. Broad shoulders, a square jaw darkened by stubble, and a thin white scar running from ear to chin like a mark left by lightning. "Luke Carver," someone whispered. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on Talbot. "Far as I can tell," Luke said quietly, his voice carrying like a cold wind through timber, "you've got plenty of land already." Talbot turned slowly, his lip curling. "This ain't your concern, Carver." "It is," Luke replied, "if you're riding through my property to claim it." A murmur spread. The 2 men had history. That much was clear. Years ago, Luke Carver had owned one of the largest cattle spreads this side of the divide, until the war took his men, his family, and what little light was left in him. He'd returned from the smoke of Tennessee battlefields a different man, quieter, harder. Since then, he kept mostly to himself, a ghost among fences and open sky. Now that ghost was standing between a widow and a wolf. The judge shifted uneasily. "Mr. Carver, I'll thank you to let this court proceed." Luke didn't move. "I'm just saying, Judge, a man's reach ought to stop where another begins. Seems to me this one's reached too far." Talbot's jaw tightened. "You plan to challenge the law?" "No," Luke said. "Just men who twist it." A ripple of tension ran through the room, the kind that made even the dust hold still. Talbot's hand drifted toward his coat pocket, where a silver revolver handle glinted. Luke's hand didn't move, but somehow everyone felt it could. "Easy," the judge barked. "No blood in my courtroom." Talbot smiled thinly, pulling his hand back. Fine. Let the woman have her pity for now. But she won't last a week out there. When she falls, the land falls with her. And I'll be waiting. He turned and strode out, boots striking hard against the floorboards. The sound echoed long after the door swung shut. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. Mrs. Hensley, you've been granted a brief reprieve. The eviction stands at week's end unless payment is made in full. Court adjourned. The gavel came down. People began to shuffle out, murmuring, glancing at Clara as if she were already gone. Luke lingered by the door, eyes shadowed beneath his hat brim. When Clara tried to thank him, words caught in her throat. He just nodded once and stepped out into the sunlight. By late afternoon, Red Rock was a ghost again. The heat rose off the street in trembling waves, and Clara walked it like a woman half dreaming. Eli trailed beside her, clutching a wooden horse his father had carved before the fever took him. They passed a saloon, where men leaned in doorways and watched her with the dull hunger of those who've seen too many hard years. A drunk shouted something crude. She kept her eyes forward. Her cabin sat on the edge of town, a sagging frame of pine and tin, built against a stretch of brittle prairie grass. The roof leaked when it rained, and the wind slid through the cracks like a thief, but it was home. She sat Eli down inside and lit the lantern, the flame trembling like her hands. "We'll be fine," she said, forcing calm into her voice. "Mom'll find work. Maybe the seamstress in town." Eli looked up. "Is that man going to come for me?" Her throat tightened. She bent and held him, his small arms wrapping around her neck. "No, baby. Nobody's taking you anywhere." Outside, a coyote howled, long, low, lonely. The sound made her shiver. As darkness fell, she set a pot of thin stew on the stove and glanced through the window. Across the distance, she could see the faint glow of lanterns on Talbot's ranch. Bright, steady, unfeeling. He had everything. She had a child and a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. When the knock came, it was soft but sure. Clara froze, her heart slamming. She reached for the old pistol her husband had left behind and opened the door an inch. Luke Carver stood there, hat in hand. Moonlight caught the edge of his scar. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said. "What do you want?" He hesitated. "To make sure you're safe." She glanced past him at the empty road. "We'll manage." He nodded once. "You won't. Not with Talbot watching. He'll send men before the week's done." "I can't leave," she said. "This is all we have." Luke looked past her shoulder at the boy asleep by the stove. His eyes softened in a way she didn't expect. "That's reason enough to leave." She studied him, unsure what to make of the silent man who had stepped between her and ruin without reason or gain. "Why are you helping us?" For a long moment, he said nothing. The wind tugged at his coat. Finally, he said, "Because once, someone should have helped me and didn't." The words landed heavy. She saw something flicker behind his calm, grief maybe or memory too raw to name. He stepped closer, voice lower now. "You got till dawn. Pack what you can carry. There's a trail north through Blood Canyon. Hard ride, but it'll get you out clean." She shook her head. "You're asking me to run from my home. I'm asking you to keep your son." Silence stretched between them, filled with the creak of the windmill outside and the soft hiss of the stove flame. She wanted to say no, to hold her ground, to prove she wasn't weak, but the image of Talbot's men taking Eli tore through her resolve. She turned away, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I don't even know where I'd go." Luke's voice came from the doorway. "There's room at my place till you figure it. Nobody crosses my line." Then he put his hat back on and walked into the dark. Clara stood for a long time after he'd gone, staring at the door at the night beyond. Somewhere out there, she could hear the low rumble of thunder or maybe horses far off. She couldn't tell which. Either way, something was coming. She moved to the window. The moon rode high over the plains, lighting the emptiness with cold silver. The prairie grass rippled like water, whispering secrets she didn't want to hear. Inside, Eli stirred in his sleep and murmured, "Mama, don't let him take me." Her heart broke cleanly, quietly. She knelt beside him, brushed the hair from his forehead, and whispered, "I won't." She sat there until the lantern burned low, the silence pressing in like a weight. At last, she stood and began to pack. One small bag, a blanket, a jar of beans, her husband's Bible, and Eli's wooden horse. When she opened the door again, the wind caught her shawl and lifted it like a flag of surrender. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called once more, answered by another far away. She felt very small, but not alone, not entirely. She could still see the outline of Luke's tracks in the dirt road leading north. By dawn, mother and child were gone from Red Rock. The house stood empty, a lantern still burning faintly in the window like a promise or a prayer. And from a ridge above the town, Luke Carver watched the first light spill across the plain. His horse stamped and snorted, eager to move. He looked toward Talbot's ranch, where smoke rose from morning fires, and then back to the tiny figure of the widow leading her boy down the trail. He tightened his jaw, mounted, and turned his horse north. The wind rose behind them, carrying the dust of Red Rock into sunrise. Neither of them knew what waited beyond Blood Canyon, but they both knew what they were leaving behind, a world that had taken all it could. And for the first time in years, Luke Carver felt something stir beneath the silence that had ruled him since the war, a purpose, faint but steady, like a heartbeat coming back to life. Dawn came thin and colorless, the sky still bruised from the night. The trail north was little more than a ribbon of dust cutting through wild sage and red stone. Clara rode side saddle behind Luke, her arms tight around Eli, who slept fitfully against her chest. The wind carried the smell of dry earth and far-off rain, and each hoofbeat drummed like a heartbeat against the silence. Luke hadn't said a word since they'd left Red Rock. He rode with his shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the horizon. Clara watched the way his hand never strayed far from the rifle holstered beneath his coat. The man seemed built from the same stubborn stuff as the land, hard, unyielding, carved by something he'd rather forget. When the sun cleared the hills, she finally spoke. "You think they'll come after us?" "They will," he said without turning. "Talbot don't like being told no." Her stomach tightened. "You think he'll try to take Eli again?" "I think men like him don't stop till they get what they want. That's why we keep riding." They rode until the sun burned high, and the horses steamed with sweat. By noon, they reached a dry creek bed where the mesquite grew thick enough to hide them from the open road. Luke swung down and led the horses under shade. "Rest here," he said, offering Clara his canteen. She drank greedily, passing to Eli, who blinked awake and smiled sleepily. "Mama, we're not home." "No," she said softly. "We're going someplace better." The boy nodded, untroubled, and started chasing a lizard between rocks. Clara watched him, her throat tightening with a mixture of love and fear. Luke crouched nearby, scanning the horizon. He chewed a piece of dry grass and said, "You ever ridden through Blood Canyon before?" She shook her head. "Only heard talk of it. Folks say it's cursed." "Cursed?" His mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "It's just rock and wind. The curse is what men bring with M." They ate what little food she'd packed, beans from a jar and a scrap of hard bread. When they mounted again, the land began to change. The flat prairie broke into a tangle of ravines and red cliffs that cut the light into shards. Every sound echoed. A crow's cry, a horse's snort, even the clink of a stirrup seemed too loud. By late afternoon, dark clouds rolled in from the west. Thunder grumbled low, and the smell of rain made the air heavy. Luke slowed his horse. "Storm's coming. There's an old mining shack a few miles ahead. We'll hole up there." The first drops came fat and sudden, splattering the dust into mud. By the time they reached the shack, the rain had turned into a downpour, drumming on the roof like gunfire. The building leaned crooked against the rock wall, its door hanging on one hinge. But it was dry, and that was enough. Luke built a small fire in the corner, the flames licking up weakly. Clara sat near it, her shawl dripping. Eli curled against her lap. She stared at the flicker of light on Luke's face, the deep lines around his mouth, the scar that cut through his beard, the quiet stillness in his eyes. "Why'd you leave Red Rock?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Didn't leave. Red Rock left me." She waited, but he said nothing more. Only the rain answered, pattering steady against the roof. When Eli fell asleep, Clara said softly, You were a soldier. He nodded once. You lose someone? His jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. A wife and a daughter. War took him same as it took everything else. I'm sorry, she whispered. He shook his head. Don't be. Sorry don't fix things. They sat in silence, the firelight flickering across their faces. For the first time, Clara saw beyond his coldness. There was pain in him, deep and old, the kind that didn't fade but settled into a man's bones. Outside, lightning split the sky. The thunder followed, closer now. Then, between the rolls of sound, Luke stiffened. He cocked his head, listening. Clara felt it too, a rhythm that didn't belong to the storm. Horses. Luke rose in one smooth motion, doused the fire with his boot, and moved to the window. Through the rain, faint shapes flickered against the flashes of lightning. Riders coming fast. Talbot's men, he muttered. Clara's heart lurched. How did they find us? Don't know. Maybe someone talked. He grabbed his rifle and threw her a look. Get the boy behind that crate. Don't move till I say. She obeyed without question, clutching Eli tight as Luke slipped outside into storm. The rain came harder, washing the world into gray streaks. From the darkness came the crack of a rifle. A bullet punched through the wall inches above Clara's head. She stifled a scream. Luke's voice cut through the storm. Stay down. 2 shots rang out in quick succession, sharp, deliberate. Then another, followed by a grunt and the sound of a man hitting the mud. Lightning flared, revealing Luke crouched behind a boulder, returning fire with calm precision. There were at least 4 of them, shadowy figures spreading out, their muzzle flashes lighting the rain like fireflies. Clara pressed Eli's head against her chest and prayed, every muscle trembling. The fight didn't last long. Luke moved like a man who'd fought too many wars to waste a bullet. When the last gun fell silent, the storm seemed to pause with it. He re-entered the shack, soaked and bleeding from a scrape on his shoulder. They're gone, he said, voice rough. For now. She looked at the blood on his sleeve. You're hurt. Not bad. You're bleeding. He gave a small shrug. Better me than you. She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it against the wound. He winced but didn't pull away. Her hands trembled as she worked. You could have been killed. So could you. She met his gaze then, and for a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed to vanish. He looked at her, not as a man looks at a woman, but as someone recognizing pain in its twin. Thank you, she said. He looked away. Don't thank me yet. They'll come again. When the storm passed, the night grew still. The air smelled of wet earth and gunpowder. Luke kept watch by the door, rifle across his knees. Clara drifted in and out of sleep beside the cold ashes of the fire. Before dawn, he woke her. We move. They rode hard through the gray light of morning, leaving the shack and the bodies behind. The land opened up again, wild and endless. By midday, they reached a small ranch tucked between rolling hills, a patch of green in the wasteland. Smoke rose from the chimney, and a line of cattle grazed nearby. Luke reined in. Calder's place, he said. Old friend from the war. He'll help us. Clara watched him ride ahead, calling out. A man came from the barn, a big, broad fellow with gray streaks in his beard and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Carver, he said, clapping Luke on the shoulder. Well, I'll be damned. Thought you were dead. Not yet, Luke said. Need a place to rest for a spell. Woman and child with me. Calder's gaze slid to Clara, lingering just a little too long. You always did pick up strays. Luke's tone hardened. They're under my protection. Calder raised his hands. Didn't mean nothing by it. You're welcome here. He led them inside, a modest house with rough timber walls and the faint smell of whiskey. Clara helped Eli wash up while Calder poured coffee for Luke. So what's your story, friend? Calder asked. Talbot. Luke said, try to take what wasn't his. Still trying. Calder grunted. That bastard got half the county in his pocket. You think you can outrun him? Not outrun, Luke said. Outlast. The 2 men shared a look heavy with memory, the kind born from foxholes and blood. But there was something in Calder's eyes that didn't sit right, a flicker of calculation beneath the warmth. That night, after supper, Clara put Eli to bed in the spare room. When she stepped back into the main room, she found Luke cleaning his rifle by lamplight. Calder sat across from him, nursing a drink. "Don't trust him," Clara whispered later, when Calder had gone to fetch more wood. Luke looked up. "Why?" "He watches you too close. And he looks at my boy the way Talbot did." Luke's jaw tightened. "If you're right, we'll know soon enough." Moments later, they heard horses outside, several of them. Luke's hand froze on the rifle. Then came the sound of voices, low and urgent. Calder returned, sweat shining on his brow. "Luke," he said, forcing a grin, "you might want to step outside. Some folks want a word." Luke stood slowly, eyes dark. "You sold us out." Calder swallowed. "It's just business. Talbot's paying more than loyalty's worth these days." Luke moved fast. He struck Calder once, sending him sprawling, and shoved Clara toward the back door. "Get the boy." Gunfire shattered the night. Glass sprayed from the window as bullets ripped through the walls. Eli screamed, clutching his mother's hand as they ducked behind the stove. Luke fired twice through the door, dropping one man before another bullet tore through his sleeve. Blood bloomed down his arm. He didn't stop. "Out the back," he shouted. They burst into the open, the cold air cutting like knives. Luke swung Eli onto his horse, lifted Clara behind, and fired a last shot before leaping up himself. They rode hard, hooves hammering the dirt, moonlight flashing off puddles from the earlier storm. Behind them, Calder's ranch burned, the flames climbing high. When they finally stopped, miles later, the horizon was pale with dawn. Luke slid from his horse, blood dripping from his arm. Clara caught him before he fell. "You're hurt worse than you said," she murmured. He gave a faint, tired smile. "Told you. They'll keep coming." She bound his arm as best she could, her hand steady now despite the fear. Eli sat nearby, eyes wide but silent. "Why do you keep helping us?" she asked again. Luke's voice came slow, weak but certain. "Because once I had a daughter her age. I wasn't there when she needed me. Maybe this time I can be—" Clara felt her throat tighten. She wanted to speak, but the words caught. Instead, she brushed the dirt from his cheek, gentle as breath. The sun crept higher, painting the land gold and red. Smoke from Calder's ranch drifted on the wind behind them, thin and distant. Luke stood, swaying slightly. "We're close now. My place ain't far." They rode again, slower this time, through the tall grass that whispered around their horses' legs. When they crested the final ridge, Clara saw it. A spread of fenced pasture, a small cabin, and beyond it, the silver ribbon of a river winding through the valley. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Luke stared at the land, his land, and for a moment there was pride in his eyes, a spark of something that looked almost like peace. Then his gaze hardened. In the distance, rising black against the morning light, a column of smoke twisted into the sky. Clara followed his stare and felt her heart drop. Luke's ranch was burning. He sat there motionless, the reins slack in his hands, watching everything he'd built turn to ash. "He found us," he said quietly. Then, beneath his breath, barely a whisper, "It ain't over yet." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke toward them. Behind them lay betrayal and blood. Ahead, fire and reckoning. Clara turned toward Luke, fear flickering with something fiercer, resolve. "Then we make our stand." Luke met her eyes. "We will." And as the flames climbed higher in the valley below, the three of them rode down into the smoke, toward whatever waited in the ruins. "Understood. Here is Section 3, exactly 1,700 words. Please, don't take my child away," begged the poor widow. Then the silent rancher stepped forward, written with a cinematic, emotional, and suspenseful tone true to the Wild West setting. The dawn came thin and cold over the plains, the kind of light that peeled back the night without warming what it touched. A veil of mist hung low across the valley, and the scent of wet earth drifted to the broken window of the ranch house. Mara stirred first, her body sore from another sleepless night, the blanket tucked tight around her boy. Little Samuel breathed softly beside her, his small hand curled against her arm, as if even in sleep he feared being taken away. Outside, the ranch lay still except for the restless shuffle of horses. The quiet man who had given them shelter, Eli Cartwright, was already awake. He stood near the corral, hat low over his brow, the air frosted around his breath. He'd been awake most of the night, too, sharpening tools, mending the barn door, and staring out into the dark like a man expecting ghosts. The boy's cough brought Mara to her feet. She warmed water over the fire and whispered prayers she hadn't spoken in years. She didn't know who would listen anymore. Her husband had been gone a long time now, shot dead by the very men who'd once ridden beside him. And though she'd buried him, his debts had risen from the grave to haunt her still. Eli stepped into the doorway. "You'll want to keep the boy close today," he said quietly, his voice rough like gravel turned into hand. Mara looked up, startled by the shadow he cast against the light. "Why?" "They're coming." He spoke it plain. Marshall rode through last night. Said the banker hired men to collect what's owed. Her blood ran cold. He wouldn't. He said he'd give me time. Bankers don't mean words, ma'am. They mean paper. And paper don't bleed. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "They can't take my child." "Not him." Eli's eyes, gray as storm clouds, lingered on her for a long moment before he turned toward the barn. "No one's taking the boy while I'm still breathing." By mid-morning, the sound of hooves broke across the silence, sharp, deliberate, and many. Mara stood at the window, her heart beating so hard she could hear in her ears. Samuel clutched her skirt, eyes wide. Dust rose from the road as 6 riders appeared, their coats long, their guns glinting under the pale sun. At their head rode a man with a silver badge pinned to his chest, the marshal, and beside him, the banker, Mr. Doyle, a slick smile carved into his face like a wound that never healed. Eli stepped out to meet them, rifle resting easy in his hands, but his stance saying otherwise. "Morning, Cartwright," the marshal called. "Heard you got company." Eli said nothing. Doyle dismounted, brushing the dust from his coat like he owned the land it fell on. "The widow owes my bank $300, he said, loud enough for Mara to hear. "Been 6 months and not a penny paid." "She's been working off," Eli replied. "You'll get your money." "I'll get what's mine today." Doyle sneered. "The court gave me claim to the boy till the debt's cleared. He's a strong lad, worth something on a freight line or mill." Mara gasped, rushing to the door. "You can't. He's my son." The marshal didn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am. The papers are signed." Samuel began to cry, his small voice breaking like a struck chord. Eli's jaw tightened. "You'd sell a child to settle a man's greed?" Doyle's lip curled. "Don't make this personal, Cartwright. You've no stake in this." Eli's rifle rose, the barrel steady as his voice. "I reckon I do." The air snapped tight. Horses snorted, shifting in the dust. The marshal's hand drifted toward his gun, but Eli's eyes held him fast. "Marshal," Eli said, "you know my record. You know what happens when a man tries to take something that ain't his." Doyle's smirk faltered. "You wouldn't dare stand against the law." "This ain't law," Eli said softly. "This is theft in a fancy suit." For a moment, no one moved. Then the wind picked up, whistling through the barn boards like a warning. Eli turned slightly toward Mara. "Take the boy. Get inside." She hesitated, tears streaking her cheeks. "Eli." "Do it," he said, not looking at her. She gathered Samuel in her arms and ran inside, the door slamming behind her just as the first shot split the morning open. The echo rolled across the valley, followed by another, then 2 more. Horses reared. Men shouted. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Mara crouched behind the hearth, clutching her boy tight, her breath coming fast. Through a crack in the window, she saw Eli standing firm, firing with cold precision, every shot deliberate. 2 of Doyle's men fell before they could reload. The marshal dove for cover behind a water trough, cursing under his breath. Doyle himself scrambled back onto his horse, fury twisting his face. "Cartwright," he bellowed, "you'll hang for this." Eli fired once more, The bullet tore through the banker's hat, sending it spinning into the dirt. Doyle paled, yanked the reins, and fled down the road. The remaining men, shaken and bloodied, followed. When the dust cleared, silence fell heavy as a prayer. Mara rushed outside, heart hammering. Eli! He was still standing, though a crimson stain darkened his sleeve. He lowered the rifle slowly and gave her a faint, grim smile. Guess that'll buy you some time. She reached for him. You're hurt. Been worse. She tore a strip from her apron, wrapping the wound. Her hands shook, but he stood still, watching her face with something that almost looked like peace. You didn't have to do this, she whispered. Yeah, I did. His voice dropped. Seen too much taken from good folks. Figured I'd draw a line somewhere. Her eyes met his, tired, grateful, afraid. They'll come back. He nodded, then we'll be gone before they do. By nightfall, the three of them were riding hard toward the western ridge, leaving the ranch and its bloodied soil behind. The moon hung low, casting silver across the plains. The air was sharp with pine and promise, though neither dared speak of hope yet. They rode for hours through gulches and ghost trails, till Samuel finally drifted asleep against Mara's back. Eli rode ahead, every sense alive to danger. Behind them, the sky glowed faintly red, fires burning where Doyle's men had turned their anger on the ranch he defended. When they stopped by a stream to rest the horses, Mara knelt by the water, the reflection of her face trembling in the current. What happens now? She asked. Eli poured water over his wound, wincing slightly. Now we find a place they won't look. There's an old cabin up in the Shiloh Hills. Belonged to a friend once. You trust it? I trust he's dead, and no one else knows it's there. She almost smiled at that. You don't say much, do you? He shrugged. Talk never saved a soul. They rode again till dawn, reaching the foot of the hills where pine forests swallowed the land. The cabin appeared like a ghost, half buried under snowmelt, its chimney leaning, its roof caved in on one side. Still, to Mara, it looked like salvation. Eli built a fire, fixed the door, and patched the leaks as best he could. The days that followed blurred into something fragile and strange. Quiet moments stitched between fear and survival. He hunted. She mended. Samuel laughed again, chasing snowflakes that melted on his tongue. But Eli knew peace like that never lasted long. One evening, as the sun died behind the ridge, he spotted riders far below, a line of dust moving up the valley road. Doyle hadn't given up. The marshal rode with him this time, and more men than before. Eli went inside, his face set. They found us. Mara froze. How? We left no trail. Men like Doyle don't follow trails, Eli said. They follow hate. She took Samuel's hand, her voice trembling. We can't run again. No, Eli said, loading his rifle. We stand. She looked at him then, not just as a quiet man who'd given them shelter, but as something steadier, older, a man who'd seen too much loss and carried it like a cross. Why are you doing this for us? She asked. Eli's eyes softened. 'Cause once someone did it for me, and I was too proud to thank her before she died. The words hung between them, fragile as the firelight flickering on the walls. When the riders reached the clearing, the wind had turned cold again. Eli stood at the door, rifle in hand. Doyle dismounted, his fury sharpened by days of humiliation. You've run far enough, Doyle spat. You can't hide from the law or from me. Eli stepped forward. You ain't the law. You're what's wrong with it. Then I'll bury you under it. Gunfire cracked like thunder through the trees. Eli moved with deadly calm, each shot finding its mark. The cabin walls splintered under the barrage, smoke and dust filling the air. Mara pulled Samuel behind the hearth, praying silently, her heart breaking with every echo. When the smoke cleared, Doyle stood alone, reloading with shaking hands. Eli limped from the doorway, blood streaking down his side, but his eyes unbroken. This is your last chance, Doyle, he said. Walk away. Doyle laughed, wild and bitter. You think you can save her? You're just another broken man trying to play hero. Maybe, Eli said, but I'll die better than you'll ever live. He fired. The sound tore the mountain stillness apart. Doyle staggered back, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief before he fell into the dust. Silence followed, pure, heavy, endless. Eli dropped to one knee, his rifle slipping from his grasp. Mara rushed to him, tears spilling as she caught him before he fell. "Eli, no, please." He looked up at her, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "Told you no one take the boy." "You're going to be all right," she said, pressing her hands to the wound, desperate. He shook his head, his breath shallow. "Ain't meant for long roads. But you and the boy, you ride west. Find the river. Follow it to town. There's a man there named Briggs. Tell him Eli sent you." "Don't talk like that," she whispered. He looked toward the door, where morning light was breaking through. "Funny thing," he murmured, voice fading. "Ain't felt peace like this in years." And then he was still. The wind rose outside, scattering ashes across the floorboards. Mara held him, her tears falling silent, Samuel clinging to her side. When she finally rose, the sun had fully broken over the hills, painting the world in gold. She looked out across the valley, where smoke curled gently from the battle's ruin, and whispered through trembling lips, "Thank you." Days later, when they reached a river town, folks spoke of a widow and her boy arriving from the mountains, of a quiet strength in her eyes, and a worn rifle tied to her saddle, engraved with the name Eli Cartwright. And some said, on still nights, if you listen close to wind to the pines, you could hear a man's voice, low and sure, saying, asterisk, "No one's talking the boy while I'm still breathing." Asterisk, because some promises never die, not even on the frontier.